rugged cross in church, and so he's going to lead us. I'm going to sit here for support, and we're going to sing right here. So we're going to sing all of them. I said, SJ, what verses do you want to sing? All of them. So turn to page 141. We're going to sing all of them.
Awesome. intentional when we talk to each other. But the other day I had the luxury of being in class with Spencer, and he come to me and said, "Hey, Preacher Don wants to talk to you after class." And I was like, "What did I do wrong? The preacher wanted to talk to me after class." And he wasn't in my class, so what did I do? He says he would ask me to come and speak today here at his church while he was gone doing a wedding. So again, thank you to Pastor Don for allowing me to be here today. I remember years ago when I was a young man, I was sitting in church. I was actually at Faith Baptist Church in LaGrange with Preacher Charles Chapman. And he was telling the story about a young man, young father sitting in the pews in the church. And the preacher got kind of long-winded. And the young man gets up in the middle of the church service and starts walking out. And the preacher stops the service and said, "Brother John, where are you going?" He said, "Preacher, I need a haircut." He said, "Why didn't you get one before you came to church?" He said, "I didn't need one." Preacher done got a little long-winded. He needed a haircut. I thought to myself, "Ain't that the truth?" So after about 2 o'clock we'll be done. I know I brought it up just a moment ago about football. For some reason that kind of resonates here in the South, and I know it does for me. But in the game of football, halftime is used for football teams particularly to correct issues that the team is facing in the first half of the game. And I don't know, I know some Georgia boys in here, of course, because we're right here at the line, going into Harris County and Alabama heading that way, so we're right here in the midst of it. But if anybody remember a particular Super Bowl, not too long ago, there was a team called the Atlanta Falcons. And they were winning like 28-3 with like 20-something seconds, I believe it was, left in the third quarter. And apparently Tom Brady during halftime wasn't too happy with the way things were going. So at halftime, he and his teammates strategized on ways that they could fix the problem, right? And there's 4 quarters in a game. So ultimately, there at the end of the 60 minutes of the football game, Tom Brady was able to take his team and come back to beat the Atlanta Falcons, down by that much. Why did I bring up football? Why did I bring up halftime? I want y'all to think about life. I'm thinking about my own life. First half of your life doesn't matter. What matters is when you hit rock bottom, when you're broken. And God uses halftime for you as a human being to reestablish what you're going to do with the last part of your life. So when you come out of halftime and you're reevaluating things that I need to do better, how I finish is ultimately what matters. And that's what happened in that football game. And the same can be said for our life. You know, this morning, when I first got here, I walked out here in the cemetery. I just kind of wanted to see some of because I knew the church was established in 1838. And I did some research, so I walked out there and I'm looking at those headstones. And I'm looking at one that was almost 100 years old. Something that's always been part of my thinking and the way I try to apply my life and the things that I do is this little dash that's out there on that headstone. One said 1895, and there's this little dash in the middle. And this man lived almost 100 years. But what really mattered, it wasn't 1893. It wasn't 1983 or whatever year it was he passed away. It was the dash in the middle. What he did during that time in his life was represented there. People he had an ability to impact, the lives that he was able to change. And I don't know who the man was, I just read over it. But that represented what he as a person, what you have the ability to go out here and have a positive impact on people and teach them about God, teach them the right way to do things, ways to live. That's what that dash out there represented to me today when I went out there and read over that man's headstone. As I talk about life and the dash and halftime and how we can change things as we begin to progress through life, there's one particular man in the Bible that stood out to me. His name was Samson. And And Samson, which we're going to be working out of the book of Judges, chapters 13 through 16. Samson was a character from the Bible that stood out to me all this past week as I was preparing for this service today. Just a real quick, I guess, synopsis of who Samson was. Samson's mother was unable to have children, but an angel of the Lord appeared to Samson's mother and told her that she would become pregnant and that she would have a son. The angel told her that when Samson is born, that she must never cut his hair, and that from birth he will be dedicated to God. Samson would begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. Samson was born to be a leader. Samson was born to do what God asked him to do. He was to be a servant to God. Samson had the ability, and I'm using today's terms, to deal with people like Rip Wheeler from Yellowstone. Anybody ever watch Yellowstone? Just stern, just tell it like it is. Don't beat around the bush. This man would just tell it like it was. But at the same time, he had the charisma of Matthew McConaughey. Just this way to just elegantly make you feel like the world is great and everything is perfect around him. Samson was every woman's dream. I don't know about you, man. There's certain guys that walk in the gym, and I'm like, there he is. First of all, you want to look like him because he's big and muscled up. But he's every man's nightmare. He's like, oh, I wish I looked like him. And, you know, you never want to walk him in the room with your significant other around because you don't want her gooing and gone at the guy, right? That's it, amen. So for you ladies in here today, I use this name because it stood out to me because I know how my wife is. And I think she can't be here today. She's at our church doing the youth, and doing, in terms of stuff that we do at our church. But I think about me walking into a room and standing there and The Rock walks in. Big, muscled up, muscle-bound guy. That's who Samson was to me in my reading. Just a big, muscled-up guy that just stood out. He had that air about him. When he walked in the room, everybody flocked to look at this gentleman. Other than the bald head, he had a typical hair. He was a muscle man, big guy. The difference in Samson was he had to take on, when he was chosen by God to be who he was and be set apart, he had to live by what was called the Nazarite vow. He had to abstain from wine or anything else, alcohol-wise, consuming it. He had to refrain from cutting his hair. And he was not to become ritually impure by contact with corpse, grapes, and even family members. He had a purpose given by God that was to deliver his people Israel from their enemies, according to verse 5. He was also a judge, and he protected his people from the Philistines. He was set apart. And just like in 2021, I confidently believe there's people in this room today. One of them, I think, was just up here singing. No, ma'am. I don't know where he went. He was set apart. The power that Samson had did not set well with the Philistine people. The people in the Philistines were not happy with the fact that he had the power that he had and was able to rule over them. Samson had power against his enemies because the Spirit of God dwelled inside of him. And each and every one of you that are here today, that are born again believers, have this same power inside of you. My question to you all that are here today, including myself, what are you doing with it? What do you do with your power that God has given you as a Christian and as a believer? Do you just walk by people and not take the initiative to try to interact with them in a positive and godly manner? Do you not try to minister to people whenever you have those opportunities? What are you doing with your power as a believer? If we as born-again believers know we have such power inside of ourselves, why are we as Christians so weak today? You know, I look around the church and I can see who the leaders are. I've already sensed it from the moment I walked in here. I feel stern. There's a gentleman here, when I shook his hand, I could somebody that people respect. So why we as Christians today feel as though we have to be weak? We don't. The issue we all face today is that Christians are losing our uniqueness. We're becoming too much like the world. When we open our mouths, when we're posting stuff on social media, when we interact with our own children, our wives, our husbands, our families, and our co-workers, who do we portray as Christians? I think that's a great question for everybody. We have Christians today that look too much like the world, and our uniqueness is not being seen. What am I saying when I say that? When you as a Christian walk into a room, you ought to have this aura about you that people want to be a part of. They want to know, where does he get this from? Where does that desire to help and love on others come from? The world today is trying to create this persona of Christians that we're not those people anymore, and we are. So I ask you that. What about you makes you unique today as a Christian? Later on in the story of Samson, he sees a beautiful woman and tells his parents to bring her to him, and he wants to marry her. The problem with this woman from the start was that she was a Philistine. And as I said earlier, Samson was chosen to rule over the people of Philistine because of the things they had done to Israel. So that would tell you from the start, this lady that he chose to be his wife was not someone that he would typically choose. She was from the enemy. Delilah, which is her name, comes into the picture of Samson's life. The name Delilah is referred to as soft to the touch. And Samson's biggest weakness was women. The Philistines knew that Samson had a weakness, and that Delilah controlled the world that Samson lived in. All men have that one woman in your life, or sometimes women in the past, that you would climb the mountains for. You would go above and beyond for. They offered her because they knew she was Samson's world. The Philistine leaders offered her a large sum of money to have her to seduce and betray Samson in telling her where his strength came from. Remember, I told you he was chosen. His power came from his hair and the way he was raised and the power that God gave him. And they knew she had Samson wrapped around her finger, and that she was the only way to get him to tell where his power came from. If she could find his power, they, the Philistines, who he ruled over, knew that they could come out from under his rule. Today they call those gold diggers. Ladies, or men too, that go after people for their money, to take money to basically turn people in or bring people's lifestyles to life. After Delilah, continued to nag at Samson each and every day, wanting to know, where does your power come from? Where do you get this from? On the fourth try to get him to give up his power source, she finally breaks it down for him. And I don't know if anybody's ever heard this before, but how can you say you love me and not tell me this about you? You just said you love me, and you have deceived me all this time. So what is she saying? Apparently you don't love me very much if you can't tell me where your power comes from. And she continues to nag, and she continues to nag. I don't know if y'all ever heard that either. He finally heard enough and told her, a razor shall never come upon my head. Meaning his power came from his hair. And that with his hair being cut, his power would leave him. He told her that once his strength left him, that he is nothing more than another man. Once she learned this information, she notified the leaders of the Philistines. But again, these were the people that he ruled. And they brought her the large sum of money that she was promised. I said that earlier. She was Her goal was to manipulate him because she knew she had him around her finger. To further manipulate Samson, she asked him to rest his head in her lap. It was at this time she summons a man to come and cut Samson's hair while he was resting in her lap. What better place and time? Once his hair had been cut, his power left him. In reality, his hair was actually not the source of his power, but rather the covenant that he had with God that he broke because he was weak. He told this woman, "This is where my power comes from." She cuts his hair, his power leaves. The angel told his mother when he was born, never cut his hair. This is where his power will come from. Samson was weak, just like many men and women, when it comes to the other sex at times. What I took away from that aspect of the story was that when we begin to live in a constant sin and run from the calling that God has for us, He's going to bring us back to Him. And that's where Samson's headed. When you and I operate outside of our calling, which was Samson's job, he was given a calling by God. We are operating outside of God's power. Our uniqueness is what separates us from the rest of this world. And when you can't tell the difference between us and the world, our impact is gone. Samson stood out for a reason. And as Christians, we stand out for a reason. But when we break the covenant with God and get out here and live like heathens, there's a wonder why we have the issues that we have. And I'm speaking for Jeremy Butler. Been there, done that, got the plaque. Club member. We all have those days where we just mess it up. Many of us that made a vow with God early on in our lives have fallen short of the vow. I myself can recall sitting at Oakside Baptist Church in 1988. Evangelist Phil Kidd was preaching. My favorite preacher to this day. As I couldn't sit any longer, I got up and I walked down that aisle to that altar. My biggest takeaway from that day was not my own salvation, although that was a great thing. It's to know that my brother and a very close friend of mine took that same vow that day to God and said, "God, I want to change. I don't want to keep living this way." And I was a young man. I don't want to be that person anymore. God, please come into my life and save me and make me whole again. What I took from that is I lost my brother in 2001. Suicide. But what peace I have today, knowing that day, because a man kept his covenant, he did what God was telling him to do, stood up when I was a young man sitting on the aisle here, praying the pew, did his job, touched my heart and my brothers, and I know today, without a shadow of a doubt, that when my time comes and I leave this world, my brother will be waiting for me. And that's something I take away from that, because that man kept his covenant. I guess my big question for myself and others that are in this room that you need to ask yourself is, why have I veered from that vow with God that I took as a young man? That was 32 years ago. Yeah, I'm that old. I know I'm just... Because like most people in this room, including myself, we can't separate ourselves from the ways of the world. We get so caught up in the ways of this world. We do not set ourselves apart. We become blind to our wicked ways, and we become blind. We begin to blend with the rest of society. We're not setting ourselves apart as Christians anymore. We become more like the world. Samson realized for himself at that time he had broken the covenant with God and began to repent, as we all should do when we veer off into a world of sin and wickedness. When we fall to our knees in a broken state, God hears each and every one of us, as He did Samson. take these pills, take these drugs, remove my eyes from pornography, give me my hair back. As we repent, we step onto the right road. That's where Samson was. He's lost his hair, he's lost his power, he's been manipulated by a woman. He's at rock bottom, but he's asking God to step back in. As Samson lost his power, lost his hair, and he's taken into captivity, they take him into a big cathedral type, I don't want to say cathedral, but a big place with columns, prison type thing. And they call Samson, who was bound in prison. During this time while he is bound in prison, the people come to mock him, they're laughing, they're filled with the spirits. And I'm not talking about the holy version, I'm talking about the liquid version. And they mock him. In Judges 16 verse 27, it says some 3,000 men and women were present in the dwelling, as well as on the rooftops, watching as Samson was being used as entertainment. He has lost his power, he's being paraded around in front of people, mocked and laughed at. Because why? He once ruled them, and now they're going to parade him around and make fun of him. As with Samson, God's calling on his life is not just about Samson, but that of others. As a Christian, your job is not for that your own self, but to impact the rest of the world for God and His kingdom. As Samson was being bound with the shackles, he was mocked and called out, and he called out to the Lord in a display of faith for all others to see. Y'all can picture this. This man is bound with chains in between two pillars, and he's asking God to come back to him. I know I've messed up, God. I've known I've been led astray. I know I broke my covenant with you, but please, God, come back to me. And God listened to him. As he braced himself between those two pillars within the dwelling, in the midst of those 3,000-something people, the building began to collapse around him. And he was able to kill more enemies of Israel and kill more people in that one event than he did in his 20 years of life as a powerful man. Why? Because he finally realized, God, you're in control. I can step outside of your will, and ultimately you're going to bring me back to it whether I want you to or not. And he was able to take all those enemies out of his world, and ultimately they perished as a part of that. In chapter 11, it says that Samson got his life right with God, and even in the last 2 minutes of his life, he did great things for God. So what does that mean? That second half of life, first half to be terrible. Halftime comes, I'm going to reevaluate where I'm going, what I'm going to do for God, and then the second half is what matters. And that's what Samson found himself doing. God uses our times of brokenness and failure to reestablish our need for Him, and a reminder that we cannot do life on our own. What's my biggest takeaway from that? And that was the shortest version. I know Pastor said 20 minutes. I'm working on it. So what am I saying with all that I've said? The question that we have, again, is that specific amount of time that we have here on earth. Even if you never leave the city of LaGrange, West Point, Pine Mountain, and only God knows when that time is up, I ask you that little dash that we talked about out there on the headstone. What will you do with that? You have the ability to change the world for good. And it may not be within this small community. But guess what? That's the job. That's your job as a Christian. What am I telling you right now? As a believer, that no matter where you are today in the game of life, it is not too late to get in that game that I talked about. Many of us, including myself, myself have been led astray time after time into a world of disappointment and failures. If you still have a breath in you, which you do at this moment, there's time for you to do the work that the Lord has given you and your gifts that you have that He's given you. I don't know anybody's situation today, anybody's life, or where you're at today in this moment. I know this world's a very broken place. But what I do have confidence in is knowing when I get to the last page, I know who wins. Right? So there's no reason I should walk out of this place today disillusioned as to what my future holds. I already know what it holds. It tells me. There's no guesswork to it. So my question to you today is, if you're that person today, and again, I've been that person. If you're at that point in your life where you're like, I'm broken, God, I want you to come into my life. Change me. Make me the man, woman you want me to be. I pray that you do not leave this church today without making that vow to God and asking Him to come into your life. Years ago, I had a friend of mine, James Elliott, came to visit church with me one day. I invited him to come back Sunday night. He didn't make it. Died in a car crash. We always hear that cliche from preachers, what if you drove by to here and passed today? Something happened to you. Well, that was a reality that day. It truly happened. And I'd heard it a million times. But what I had confidence in with James is I knew him inside. But had he not been, that would have been a reality that day. It wouldn't have been a cliche that I heard every Sunday. The Bible tells us in Romans 10, 13 through 17, for whoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. I ask you if that's you today, that you pray, that you make that change in your life today. I don't want to see anybody go to hell. If I've got a part in the process to ensure that you don't, I'm going to do whatever I have to do. And I may get on your nerves, but I'm going to keep on, and I'm going to keep on, and I'm going to keep on. And as believers, that's our job. There's a lot of people perishing and going to hell today because we as Christians aren't doing our job. I don't know if y'all have a particular song we want to play here towards the end for Alan. We did say that. So I would ask that y'all would stand and let's sing. And again, if this is your day, this is your time. I pray that God touches your heart today, molds you, makes you who He wants you to be today. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful. We're on page 330 in the Brown hymnal, page 330, and I was noticing, look at the bottom of that page. It says, God's promise to us, it says, is strength. And I thought, how funny that we just learned so much about that in the story of Samson. So let's sing together Amazing Grace. We're going to sing 1, 4, and 5 this morning. 1, 4, and 5.
me help if I give the Lord's Prayer, Dr. I'm sorry, the salvation prayer here, if there's someone here today, before we go. But if that is you today, I just ask that you close your eyes and say, oh Lord, I know I'm a sinner. I know I deserve hell. I believe Jesus Christ died for me. And I believe with all my heart that he rose from the dead. I ask you to save me right now and give me everlasting life. I believe in Jesus Christ, and I trust you to save me. Amen. I pray that if you prayed that prayer today between you and God, then when you walk out of here, that you don't just say that prayer, I'm saved, and move on. That you begin to breathe, apply it, live it, but most of all, show it. Be unique today when you walk out here. When you go to lunch today, walk by a stranger.